Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating, really deep dive into a very specific psychological theory that we've pulled from our source material. We're going to unpack how crying functions in a relationship, not just as a natural emotional release, but actually as a psychological tool and strategy. The material we're analyzing today presents a very distinct, culturally grounded view on gender dynamics, and it looks at tears from both a male and a female perspective. Now, our goal today is just to map out these arguments objectively and clearly visualize the mechanics of what the speakers actually describe as the weaponization of tears.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Right out of the gate, we're confronted with this incredibly provocative premise directly from the male speaker in our source text. Tears are a lethal weapon in the female arsenal. Now, we aren't here to endorse this viewpoint, but rather to objectively deconstruct it for you. The speaker argues that crying in a relationship is rarely just, a spontaneous overflow of emotion. Instead, he completely frames it as a highly effective, deeply ingrained tactical maneuver used to gain the upper hand.
So to understand exactly how the source builds this argument, we're going to follow a quick 5-part roadmap. First, conditioning and gender dynamics. Second, tears as soft power. Third, the stoic male response. Fourth, the economics of crying. And finally, manipulation versus genuine grief.
Starting things off with Section 1, Conditioning and Gender Dynamics. The whole foundation of the source's argument rests on the claim that our childhood upbringing fundamentally hardwires our adult emotional responses. According to the text, society basically creates this stark divide from a very young age. For males, young boys are taught to completely suppress their feelings. They're subjected to what the speaker calls shaming techniques, essentially being told that crying is a sign of weakness or something only girls do. Conversely, the female experience is described as vastly different. The source argues that young girls discover early on, often through interacting with their fathers, that tears are literally a superpower. They learn that crying immediately activates a male's protective instinct, which effectively transforms a moment of vulnerability into a tool for securing care and affection.
Which brings us to Section 2, Tears as Soft Power.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that the source argues this childhood superpower doesn't just disappear in adulthood. It doesn't go away, it simply evolves into a much more complex relational strategy. The text entirely redefines crying here. The speaker doesn't view tears as a loss of control, but rather as soft power. And in the context of this material, soft power is the deliberate use of tears to activate those male protective instincts and ultimately force a change in the man's decisions. It's framed as a strategic way to navigate right around direct conflict by eliciting sympathy.
To back up this theory, the male speaker points to several cultural examples where he claims tears grant instant credibility. For instance, he references the high-profile Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case, arguing that tears were specifically used there to mask manipulation. He also points to regional talk shows like Shoff TV, noting this recurring pattern where divorced women will allegedly list their grievances and then immediately follow them up with tears to secure public sympathy. Furthermore, he claims this soft power is actively amplified by a sisterhood, like a built-in societal alliance where women will automatically support a crying woman, which places immense and immediate pressure right back on the man.
All right, moving along to Section 3, the stoic male response.
So how does this source say a man should actually navigate this landscape? Well, the speaker outlines what he views as a highly orchestrated manipulation cycle. Step 1, the woman brings up past issues or grievances, essentially fishing for a reason to be upset. Step 2, the tears begin. But Step 3 is the absolute most critical part of his whole theory. He claims that while she's crying, she is actively monitoring the male's reaction. The source insists that the tears are essentially a test to see if she can successfully command the man's attention and validation.
To counter this cycle, the source drops this incredibly vivid metaphor. Be the solid mountain against the waves of female emotion. The text characterizes female emotion as hormonal, turbulent, and constantly shifting, like ocean waves. In stark contrast, the male is instructed to be the immovable, unshakable mountain. The advice is to completely, 100% detach from the emotional storm.
And the practical application of this mountain metaphor, it's very specific. The speaker explicitly advises men to show absolutely zero emotional reaction. If a man reacts at all, he's giving validation and proving that the tears work. Instead, the speaker suggests letting her cry without interfering and then entirely redirecting the conversation to something totally mundane. The specific and, honestly, rather controversial example provided in the text is to calmly ask, "Did you heat up dinner?"
The goal here, according to the source, is to short-circuit that crying cycle by proving it yields absolutely no emotional payout. And this brilliantly illustrates the underlying power struggle, which the text says is particularly clear during the silent treatment. For the trap, here's how it plays out. A disagreement happens, the man withdraws, and the woman cries. The source claims she does this to elicit pity, essentially forcing the man to break his silence and apologize, which allows her to save face and protect her pride. In response, we have the stoic counter. By remaining totally unresponsive, the man maintains his boundaries, flat out refusing to be manipulated into apologizing when he feels he hasn't done anything wrong.
Now let's flip the script and look at Section 4, the economics of crying.
We are shifting gears now because the source material also includes an Algerian female speaker who addresses this exact same topic, but she frames it using the language of economics and value. She offers this pivotal piece of strategic advice. If you don't make your tears expensive, your husband won't feel for you. It is such a fascinating parallel to the male speaker's points. She is totally acknowledging that tears are indeed a tool, but she is warning women about emotional inflation. If there's an oversupply of tears, their value completely plummets.
Let's break down this economic theory a bit more. With frequent crying, she warns that if a woman cries over every little thing, like, say, just not going out for the evening, the man is going to view her as childish, he'll stop caring, and he will eventually ignore the tears entirely. But looking at rare crying, if a woman rations her tears, keeping them scarce, they retain high value. When she finally does cry, it triggers deep concern. The man will literally be afraid of breaking her, his protective instincts will kick right in, and he'll be genuinely worried about her well-being. Scarcity, she argues, is the ultimate secret to impact.
She blames all of this confusion on what she calls the soap opera myth for misleading women. The speaker argues that television dramas and movies have basically brainwashed women into believing that men find highly sensitive, constantly weeping women attractive or sympathetic. She clearly states that this is entirely false information. In reality, she argues, men deeply dislike women who cry constantly.
Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds into our final point, manipulation versus genuine grief. Because, as rigid as these rules seem, the original male speaker does provide some absolutely vital caveats to his Stoic philosophy. He explicitly warns men against taking his advice to the extreme, stating you really have to be intelligent enough to recognize the difference between tactical crying and genuine grief. Tactical crying is about a minor disagreement or crying just for attention. Genuine grief, however, involves real trauma, and his specific example here is the death of a relative. He notes that coming home from work, seeing your partner crying over a death, and acting like a stoic mountain would be disastrous for the relationship. The strategy of non-reaction only applies to perceived manipulation, never ever to real tragedy. However, if a man successfully identifies tactical crying and employs the Stoic method, the source warns that he is definitely going to face pushback. The woman might deploy phrases like, "You don't love me anymore, your heart is like stone." The speaker identifies these statements purely as bait. They're designed to pull the man right back into a dramatic, unwinnable argument. And the advice? Never swallow the bait, because engaging in the drama only feeds the cycle all over again. So, to summarize the source's ultimate conclusion on these relationship dynamics, the text essentially frames the modern woman's role, which it says is heavily influenced by media, as being prone to emotional chaos and drama. To counterbalance this, the man's advised role is absolute emotional stillness and control. The speaker concludes that a man who controls his reactions is ultimately more attractive, basically acting as the necessary anchor of stillness to her emotional volatility. Which brings us to the end of our analysis, and I want to leave you with a final, really provocative question to think about. How much of our conflict behavior is shaped by societal conditioning versus genuine emotion? The source material we looked at today paints a picture of relationships as almost a strategic chessboard, deeply defined by gender roles and early upbringing. Whether you agree with the concept of tears as soft power, or you find the Stoic mountain approach way too rigid, it certainly forces us to examine the mechanics of exactly how we communicate when the stakes and our emotions are running high. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those great questions, and I'll catch you next time.